Good morning and welcome. Welcome to this 19th webinar in the Get in Shape webinar series. This is a series of webinars set up by the Financial Services Council with the objective of helping financial advisors and financial advice providers understand your requirements under the Financial Markets Conduct Act and to give you some pointers about how to adapt your business to prepare. As I say, this is the 19th webinar in the series. If you want to see earlier webinars in the series, they've all been recorded and they're all available at the FSC's website at advice.fsc.org.nz. And there's a range of webinars on a number of different topics from governance and education, all sorts of topics there, and it's well worthwhile having a look. Today's webinar is on the topic of the customer journey and the code of conduct, how this could influence or should influence your advice process. And it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. You'll be familiar with both of them, I'm sure. We have Steve Burgess from Compliance Refinery, well known to most advisors now as one of the fantastic compliance advisors who will go around and help you adapt to this regime. And we've got Tracey Cross, who is a partner at DLA Piper. And for all of you, I'm sure you've all read the FSC's disclosure guide. Tracey was one of the fantastic contributors to that document, as well as being a partner in one of the great law firms that is out there giving financial advice providers significant legal advice in this area. So thank you and welcome to you both. I think it's probably time to get started with the webinar, but actually before we begin, we were just chatting prior to the webinar beginning and talking about the process of applying for a full license. And really one little hint that we can give you early on is if you read through the licensing questions, which are available for a download from the FMA website, it's worthwhile going through, and if you're currently answering no to any of those questions, it's a good idea to go back and look at your business and adapt your business so that you can change your answer to yes. And once you've got yeses for all those questions, that's probably the right time to start thinking about applying for your full license. But without further ado, I'll hand it over to Steve, I believe, who's going to get us started, and Haley will flip us over to the next slide. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks, Mark. Great to be here once again with yourself and Tracey. Looking forward to it. Today, we'll be talking through the code of conduct, the customer experience, and customer demographics. As customers age, their needs change, and advisors need to change with them. If we can pop over to the next slide. So we were going to briefly touch on the code of conduct today. I know a lot of you have probably heard a lot. Some of you think you've heard too much, and hopefully some of you think you've not heard enough about it. But we were just going to give you, I was just going to kind of talk through a couple of points in terms of the changes that we're all experiencing with the new code. So it's no longer just for AFAs. I do feel the need to call that out, but that is an important concept, that we're all in the same boat going in the same direction here. So there's only one expected standard under this regime. Understanding is a key concept. I think what we've seen as we've progressed is that there's been quite a bit of controversy over this point, especially with a few prominent people in the industry. We don't see this as a hurdle or as something that's difficult to achieve for your clients. If you're giving good advice and keeping your clients' goals in mind, you should definitely be able to reach that standard. It means you have to consider things like your client's sophistication level and explain it on their terms. Make sure that you're giving robust enough explanations, that you're tying in the products to features and how they meet the goals and or the limitations when you're giving advice. We don't think this should be a point of angst for advisors at all. It's something that any good advice process, that standard should be met. Limitations and implications. Any limitations on advice we find are dealt with a couple of ways. You can have kind of limitations in the sense that you have product limitations and or fact find limitations. So maybe a client doesn't want to give you advice. One of the key call-outs there that I'll mention is we deal with advisors that don't do fact find limitations. So what they do is they've got a lot of confidence in their process and they explain to their client what the benefits of a robust process and how that can the implications can be very positive for their long-term future and into retirement. We find if advisors are confident in having those conversations, that the full advice process in almost always 99% of the time goes forward. It's those cases where the advisor isn't as practiced and confident in terms of removing those limitations. So that's an important thing for you to think about if you do have a lot of clients requesting limitations to the scope on that fact-find side. And evidence. We always think in terms of evidence, the advice process should read like a book. And that means file notes, that means excellent explanations and record keeping. But basically, you want to start kind of with that scope or those original documents and be able to get right through to the end of the implementation period and understand exactly why everything happened and have it tied in nicely. It's not, we find the majority of businesses get to that standard, but that's what we expect to see in terms of that evidence. One thing we'd call out, and this will be called out a couple of times during this webinar, is be careful with messenger services. They're great. Most advisors, if not all, are using them now. If you're not, you should think about it. But that record keeping process, how are you keeping records when you're using those? We find that's where a lot of businesses fall down. And I'm sure Tracey will echo these comments, but file notes are absolute gold. Take your file notes, be robust with them, make sure they are part of your record keeping process. I will pass off to Tracey to talk you through the specific areas of the first part of the code.
Cool, thanks, Steve. Hayley, if you could just move to the next slide. Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're 4 months into the new regime now, and look, I think it's always important to reflect, quite regularly along the way when we're looking to comply with the new regime. And this is an opportunity to really just touch on those code standards again. The code standards can't be read in isolation to the legislation of the 8, duties under the legislation that you need to comply with as an advisor. One of those is to comply with the code standards. So, these are non-negotiables. I know that you would have been doing them, throughout your sort of career, but there's always an opportunity to do better and just to sort of pause and reflect on sort of how you run your business and how you're interacting with your client. The FMA just released their annual corporate plan this week, and it just further emphasises the focus on the customer, the good conduct, etc. So this just continues to highlight the importance of these code standards as part of your compliance with the new regime. So I know we've been over these many, many times and you would read them. I'm sure you've read all the commentary around the codes, but just as Steve said, to touch on these briefly. The first 2 code standards, 1 and 2, to me sort of underpin the expectations, treating clients fairly and sort of acting with integrity. And that's, comes back to the point that the customer really is at the heart of what's important. And I don't need to tell you that. It's how you interact with them. It's the strength of the relationship you have with them. As an advisor, you're accountable for the client outcomes, and all clients are different. So it really is strengthening up that relationship on an ongoing basis, making sure that, you're treating them with respect, you're listening to them, you're aware of sort of the changes that they've got going on in their life, throughout their lives. And you are sort of ensuring that, you're acting with integrity all along the way, in full disclosure, dealing with any conflicts that might arise, so that you can lead your client through the advice journey. As Steve touched on, Code Standard 3, the obligation to give suitable advice, that's having regard to the nature and scope. I mean, that is just so important. You will all have your processes set up around, your advice process with your client, confirming what the nature and scope is. It's really important, obviously for the client, because it sort of dovetails into the client's ability to understand the advice, but it's really, really important for you, so that you can then evidence, the advice that you've given the client, the nature and scope of it. As Steve said, records are really, really important, that you can evidence that the client understood the nature and scope, so if there are any questions moving forward, either from the client or the regulator, you can very much sort of support what you've done and evidence what you've done. This is just so essential in this new world that we're moving into. And this whole process, the advice that you're given is all to enable the client to make a timely and an informed decision about the sort of the products that they may purchase or dispose of, or how they are sort of setting themselves up for sort of their future goals in retirement. So really, really important that we really comply with these sort of standards, that they are part of our everyday relationship with the client, and that we do have these first and foremost. The fifth standard is really around client information, because of course, through your relationship, your discussions with the clients, you're amassing a lot of information. So the duty to protect that information is again very much a basic sort of duty and code standard that we need to be cognizant of, and of course that dovetails into general privacy standards. So the code, if you haven't read it, I'm sure there's no one that hasn't read it, get it out, have a look at the commentary. It is very easy to understand, although there will be nuances in respect of, how you deal with clients all along the way. Be interesting to get some feedback at the end with regard to how your clients are actually reacting to some of these new ways of, sort of running your business and interacting with them. Often clients don't want to be sharing information, or are hesitant about any changes in how they interact with their advisor that they might have had for 20 years. But this is all for their benefit. It's all around transparency. It's about better advice. And it is the systems there are there to support you and really sort of, ensuring that the clients understand that advisors are providing a very professional and valuable service. So, this is all important. So I think we'll move on to the client journey now. Steve's just going to run it through with us, and we thought we'd sort of overlay the code throughout this journey.
Yep. Thanks, Tracey. That was fantastic. One thing I wanted to comment on as we start this is that as we go through the client journey, a lot of times this is the first time your first meeting with a client is potentially the first time that clients ever accessed financial advice or met with an advisor, which, you've got a lot of sophistication, and the client might be quite a novice and quite inexperienced as they go through the process, not knowing what to understand and expect. And it could really take you years to build that strong relationship you have with a lot of your existing clients that you've had for a number of years. So certainly something to always consider. And as you get to that initiation process, a lot of times that's, that can be calls, that can be referrals, but you're coming through to the client. And then all of a sudden the client's got this person asking them a lot of sensitive questions. And like I said, if you don't have a previous relationship with the client, you guys are generally very good at creating, a lot of advisors have a great skill set to kind of build those relationships quickly, but that can be a bit overwhelming for clients at times. And sometimes different clients need to work through the process in different ways. The advice process, once you kind of get into that, where you're saying, okay, let's spend some money on this intangible thing called financial advice. One of the things I think that's important to call out, and sometimes we on this side of the industry do a bit of a disservice, is how different the advice process is for different product lines. Like a home loans process is very different from a risk process, which is different from an investment. And GI is just kind of in a space on its own. Well, largely was in the past regime anyway. But is it something really important for you to consider, that the advice process is quite a bit different? And I think in that advice process, like we've gone to a couple of client meetings with clients. When we went to, in the client's house, the dog's running around, the wife's making dinner, the husband's just, quite frankly, not the most financially literate person. So quite an interesting process that you guys have to go through. And there are a lot of barriers to work through. And that's why, generally when you're skilled at that, that's what makes you a skilled financial advisor. But it's really important to go through and document those. And although a lot of you don't ask about the code, the advice process generally imparts the different areas of the code in the spaces they need to be in. Implementation and review, those are probably the areas that we're going to focus on a little bit more today. Quite important areas that I think we refer to advice process, and advice is at a point in time. And for an advisor, you go through and you say, okay, that's in this world, it's largely been set and forget, especially on the risk side of the industry. But now we're going into kind of implementation and review. Implementation is where we often see the need for file notes and the need for record keeping fall over, especially in that risk space. And then you get to that review cycle, and how robust is your review cycle? Is it largely based on kind of passive attempts for non-responses, or are you actually trying to engage clients? We'll talk a little bit more about that later. I'll pass over to Tracey for the next slide.
Thanks, Steve. Hayley, thank you. So with that in mind, we've just really overlaid the code across that sort of customer journey, and sort of looking at where these 5 standards really sort of come into play. So obviously treating clients with sort of integrity and treating them fairly goes throughout the customer journey, and I think that that's sort of pretty obvious. I mean, as Steve said, you make that initial contact, or a client is referred to you, they don't know you at all, so it's really you're starting to sort of build that relationship with them, through that sort of inquiry sort of process. You're asking questions, you're collecting information. That can be quite a challenging time for sort of clients, in respect of one, talking about money, which the majority of us don't really like to do, and we've all got our money stories that sort of impact that. So that whole sort of process, really, the clients need to be sort of treated with sort of respect, listened to, really sort of taken along sort of an easy manner. And of course, through that sort of that development of the relationship, you are coming to know your clients. You're coming to sort of understand any vulnerabilities that they may have, which is a very important part of treating your clients fairly and not taking advantage of any of their vulnerabilities. And I can remember a story being shared with me that there was a broker who had been acting for a client for sort of many years, and thinking that he'd been doing a great job, and he had been doing a great job providing them with lots of information, etc. But it turned out that the client actually wasn't very capable with their reading ability. So all the wonderful information that the advisor had been provided just wasn't actually sort of meeting the mark. So, that ability to spend time and really develop that relationship, listening to clients, treating them fairly at that sort of time and then throughout, it's just really important. I mean, and so, that all flows through to the advice process. Obviously, when we get to the advice process, we've got the standard around ensuring suitable advice is given. So that nature and scope very much is at the forefront of that sort of stage of the journey. And then ensuring that the client sort of understands that. And, it's a two-way relationship. It's not necessarily just you doing all the work. The client is an important part of the whole discussion. And that ability to test a client's understanding with them is really important. It's a two-way relationship. It's a discussion. It's going back and really sort of testing that the client understands the advice that you're providing by, certainly not just getting them to sign a form saying, yes, I understand everything. It's really treating them fairly and with respect, and having a discussion, being really interested and checking what they might need. I mean, you might have a situation, for example, whereby you can see very clearly that a couple that you are giving advice to, one of them just doesn't get it. So it's actually taking the time, maybe having a separate discussion with that person, whatever it takes to make sure for you to get that comfort that they have understood the advice. So a very important, sort of journey. And as Steve said, it's really important to document that journey with your clients, so that you can actually show through your advice process just what you've done, what you've advised on, how you've explained the nature and scope of your advice, how they've understood it, how you have tested that. And as I said, it isn't just getting them to sign a form saying, yes, I've understood the advice that you've given. It really is, the expectations are more than that. It's ensuring on reasonable grounds that they have understood the advice. And you can do that by simply asking them, having further discussions, continually coming back or going over things, and only proceeding when you have actually got the comfort to move forward. And then throughout this whole customer journey, as we've said, you've got that obligation to be protecting the client's information. But Steve, you're advising some clients all the time in relation to this practical client journey. Have you got some other pointers that you'd like to contribute there?
I think in the next few slides, we'll cover off a number, but I think you did quite good at covering the majority of those.
One thing that I'd like to add there around the review stage, for the financial advisor, you're going back and reading your notes about the conversation that you had maybe a year or a year and a half ago, and then you're going into the client review with that information kind of fresh in your mind again, whereas the client hasn't taken notes from that original meeting that you had with them. And while you established that rapport and stuff a year ago and had a couple of meetings at the time, a lot will have happened in the client's life in the last 12 to 18 months. And so going back and thinking about that conversation that you had a year ago isn't really going to be front of mind for them. A lot of the things you explained to them at the time of that first meeting or those first couple of meetings will have completely gone from their minds. So it's almost like I'm sure you already have this experience where you're trying to bring them back to that present, to the information that you've informed them about, and kind of re-educate them on what you did that year ago and tell them why that review is important to them.
Mm. And I think that's really a good point, Mark. I mean, the review, we often sort of forget some of the important or undermine or devalue some of the important things that actually happen, throughout our lives. So, it's really, it is a valuable sort of time to sit down with an advisor and to just actually reflect and review and to sort of be reminded, well, what happened there and what was the impact of that? Because otherwise we don't sort of tend to do it ourselves. So, the advisors, you do offer a very valuable service in that respect.
Yeah, and I think what we see is advisors tend to generalize a little bit and think, oh, not that much has changed. If you've been alive for the last year, you can't think of many people whose net worth hasn't gone up or, their life hasn't changed a fair bit, which generally means you should be progressing to that review stage in terms of a full review as opposed to kind of more a passive attempt. Moving on to the next slide, Haley. So the customer experience, no more set and forget. And this is a term that was new to me when I arrived in New Zealand. But essentially what we have to realize is the advice piece, although the advisor works up to the advice piece and the advice is the focal point of the advisor's interaction, the rest of the client's life with those products is actually the focal point of their interaction. It's the start of their journey, whereas a lot of times I think it's considered the end of the advisor's journey. And certainly, we had an advisor who said, oh, I had a client call, I hadn't spoken to them or heard from them in 40 years. And you're thinking, well, that's probably not the best outcome for that client. So it's important to realize that the bar has changed and we're in a different era. Although advice exists at a point in time, people change quite considerably over the years. And we have advisors who talk about review process and say, oh, that doesn't seem, oh, we shouldn't necessarily review them that often. And you think, the majority of people have massive life changes between the ages of 30 and 50. They're often getting married, buying houses, changing jobs, having kids, and all of those should initiate a review and I guess a reevaluation of what their experience is with financial products. So it's quite important to consider that as you go through the next stage of the process. And like I said, we'll focus a bit more on implementation and review in the second half of this. Haley, can you pop over to the next slide, please? So I just wanted to go through a few things in terms of the review process and some of the things that we find that can, I guess, go a little bit wrong. Remember, your statement of advice sets the scene. So you need to do as you say, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. But if you say you're going to do something in your statement of advice, you need to actually do that. Take care with any review statements. We see a lot of groups who confuse saying we will review you with we will offer you a review. Those are two very, very different things. And when you think about your data strategy, you need to think about that as well, because offering a review is different from a review. So if you note in the client's record that you reviewed them on a certain date, sending them a passive email that 2% of your client base or less responds to is not an actual review. You should always consider what date did you actually meet with the client and go over their personal circumstances. They're very different things. We see these confused a lot, and this can get you in trouble. So the review process is very different for different products. I think in that investment KiwiSaver space, it's usually annually or biannually, but the trigger is often when the client's actually made a purchase. Home loans, risk, and GI, they're usually renewal based. So we like to see, you usually see something instigated from a product provider saying this renewal is coming up. We need to act with that client. One of the real confusing points we have is advisors dealing with different subsets. So as an example, you have a client that got a home loan on this date, bought a risk policy on this date, and the KiwiSaver is another date. So it's important to have considerations when you're putting together your review process. How are you going to approach that? What is the key product there that really needs to be addressed over that period of time? Do you actually need a couple of different reviews over the year? Because it is important to review the home loan that's coming up. Also very important to review the risk piece. So maybe you change the KiwiSaver review date to fold in with one of those, and those can be at different times. Something that's really changing in the industry right now is agency agreements. Really important that you read your agency agreements and you know your obligations in your agency agreements. We see a lot of advisors who aren't very active with them. They are becoming more prescribed in terms of what's expected of you. We expect this to continue to change over time. They are not the passive documents that they used to be. As an example, I used to work at A&P. We looked at all our agency agreements at one point, and there was a surprising number of them that we had agency agreements with dead people. So that's not the case anymore. That's changed significantly in the last couple of years. These are contracts. Tracey can probably talk to the validity of contracts and the power of contracts, but these are contracts you have that enable you to get paid. And you've got certain expectations you have to meet. If you don't meet those expectations, the ramifications can be very significant for your business. And what we will, just a quick observation, advisors that go through significant stress don't last in the industry long. Older advisors that go through significant stress last in the industry a very short period of time. Even if they get the positive outcome they wanted, it has a very detrimental outcome to A, your productivity, and B, your enthusiasm for the industry, not to mention what stress can do in terms of mental health and physical sickness. So as a FAP, as a director of a FAP, understand and know your agency agreements.
Just picking up very briefly on that point, Steve, I think that is really important, and it's some agency agreements, and we're talking about code standards, we're talking about legislative obligations under the regime. You know, it's getting a handle across all of that, and right from the start. So you're actually setting your foundations, and if they're firm and solid, you know, that's going to decrease the stress. If you're sort of chasing your tail, trying to keep up with obligations or things that you haven't understood from the start, that's not an ideal sort of situation to be in. So you very much support that, you know, review, make sure you understand all of your obligations, including those within the agency agreements.
Yeah, and if you don't understand them, call your BDM and sit down with your BDM and go through it, potentially even have them do a bit of a training session on what the obligations are so you don't seem like the bad guy. Can always pass that off to someone else. Okay, could we jump on to the next slide? Haley, please. So the typical review process that we would see is very passive. And that's one of the things that we struggle with at times. So a large number of FAPs will generally send some type of automated, some are very basic personalization, but an email to clients. Everybody knows that very few people actually respond to these. Sometimes they're going to junk folders, sometimes they're just lost in, I think we all probably get more email than we would like from everybody we've ever dealt with at some point. And that's also a very important consideration in terms of how often you're communicating with clients. Sometimes the more you communicate, the less likely they are to engage with you at an important time like the review process. So what we typically see is a large number of FAPs will send out an automated or personalized email, basic personalized email. It'll go to the clients. There's a very, very low response rate. Then you pop over to the other side, and some, which we love this process, will send through a text or a messenger follow-up, which is a great practice. And if they don't get a response from that, which you get a lot more responses from text and messenger, they'll give a call and they'll actually allocate that to somebody in the business that you have to actually call them. Important here, as Tracey noted earlier, is the record keeping. So if you're sending that text or messenger, you need to follow that up with a record keeping. Some CRMs, you can actually text right out of it. So that record's boom, right there, fantastic. But that doesn't go with messengers. And we're finding a lot more businesses communicating via messenger, which is, any way you can engage a client, we would encourage you to, as long as you have a record keeping process that allows you to keep up with it. The call is great. Oftentimes those aren't recorded or anything like that. So just make sure that you've got a file note or you note it in your CRM. And one of the biggest things that we find is the best businesses, the best practice, have a maximum period of no review. So after 3 years, you have to get in touch with that client. And that's either allocated to a senior support person or the advisor. And they have to make best efforts to get in touch with that client. And some of them define that differently. Some of them, it's 3 calls. We've had one kind of, that actually goes and stops at their house from time to time, if that's practical. But you need to think about what that maximum period of review is. And we like to see it, of no review. We like to see that at 3 years, and potentially, some move out to 5. To be honest, most businesses don't have it, but I would say best practice is 3. I think about my life after the last 15 years, it's changed substantially every 3 years. And I think most people most people's lives flat out changes every 3 years quite substantially. So something really important for a business to consider in terms of how they're keeping on top of clients, how they're helping their client evolve as they progress towards retirement.
And I think part of that, in considering that review process, it's sort of what's going to work for the client, because, all the clients like things differently. And I know, it used to really annoy me, to be perfectly honest. My sort of touch point was with my advisor was an annual calendar. And oh my goodness, or the other thing was a birthday card. Never hear from him any other time, aside from these, things in the mail, which just used to infuriate me. So I think actually, in short, that won't happen now under this new regime. I certainly hope not. But, it's actually what works well. And if you've got that client relationship, it's more authentic if you're having the sort of more regular review or sort of touch points with them. So I think it is really thinking of this from the client, the relationship perspective, rather than just sort of compliance. The other point I just sort of pick up is around those records, which, just can't stress enough how important they are, primarily for your client, for yourself, to show the regulator. It's a whole show me, don't tell me world that we're in now. Just make sure that your records are appropriate, that you don't have any random notes scribbled on them, that when you do come to show the regulator or what have you down the track, there might be something that doesn't quite sound very good or look very good. So just something to be mindful. You want professional records that you're going to be happy sharing should they be required moving forward.
On that point, I have a great story. In my previous life back in Canada, we started a client recording. So when you made a phone call, you would record the client's conversation. We had one client that made a complaint. And so we thought, oh, this is great. We've got the conversation. The advisor was absolutely in the right. However, the discussion in that call, we just decided to pay out something like $40,000 as opposed to ever have that go into any type of public record. So Tracey's point around keeping it professional, you know, you're a professional, you want to be treated as a professional. This isn't what did you do at the bar, you know, any one of a number of things. It doesn't matter how good of friends you are. You need to have your advisor hat on. As Melanie would say, you know, she goes to a doctor, they have a really good personal conversation, and then the doctor hat comes on and it's all professional. So make sure that you have that professional hat on in your record keeping, especially if you're recording calls. They don't help if you don't want them released, if you don't want to use them to support your case. Yes. Haley, can we pop over the next slide, please? So best practice for reviews. What we really like to see is kind of a monthly process where support staff will prepare a list of clients coming up for review. You're going to sit down with the team, and sometimes obviously that can just be two of you, and you're going to say, okay, who's responsible to contact these clients? Who's responsible to contact these clients? In that renewals list, what you'll ideally have is when was the client actually reviewed? Not offered a review, but actually reviewed, which, like I said previously, is very, very important. And you should consider your data strategy there, because if you have to go through and look at documents, it's going to be very hard to figure out that information. So you're going to go through that list. Sometimes they'll be allocated. If somebody hasn't been reviewed for 3 or 5 years, you know, you're going to allocate those immediately to an advisor and say, you know, send out the email, get on, text them, however, and then, you know, you need to make best efforts to get in touch with this client. If it's a year ago, you might just say, okay, we're going to send out, you know, our email, and then we'll send out a personalized email, or we'll send out a text and a messenger kind of thing. And, you know, certainly with some clients that you actually know they've had a change. As an example, you reported last year that, you know, they were going, or, you know, you've seen in the media that they've quit their job and they've started up a business. You've seen that in your hometown. You know that they've had a baby, those kinds of things. So be very, you know, if you know there's a life milestone that will require changes to their product lines, you know, be very proactive in that space. But generally, like, we think best practice, certainly everybody should be reviewed every 3 years. Some go 5, but as just being honest, most don't have a kind of maximum period of no review. So be on top of that, really consider that. Something I did want to mention is we have, you know, we're an industry that kind of, the law says kind of, this is what you should do. Industry sometimes falls back on best practice. And as businesses are maturing, as they're using technology better, as they have better data and better systems, you know, if the majority in the industry is working their way to 3 years and all of a sudden you don't even have a minimum period, that's something that can be considered by regulators as they review you and as they look at your business, and is certainly something that reflects on how you address clients and deal with clients. Can we pop over to the next slide, please, Haley?
Steve, I wonder here whether it's worth mentioning what the FMA have said about people who are buying books. In the full licensing guide, they suggest that if an advisor has bought a book of clients, they expect them to review all the clients in that book within 12 months. What do you think they expect in terms of those reviews?
Yeah, and I think that's a point that's getting more difficult as we progress forward. If you're buying a book, you should be doing some due diligence on that book. So you want to look at the quality of data in that book, because if you can go into that book and say, oh, actually, let's just say it's 1,000 clients, so 350 have been actually reviewed in the last year, and you can actually see the data coming out of that book and say, okay, these are the ones we need to focus on. Let's go forward with that. It's going to make it obviously very difficult for most businesses, especially smaller businesses, to take on books in that case. So you'll need to definitely have a plan. I think historically we've seen businesses just bought and, in different formats, in the sense that some will just buy a customer base and not buy the actual business, but you're just buying those renewals. So what's your actually plan to deal with those? Because if you've got 2,000 clients and you're going to 3,000, logically one thinks you need additional resource to handle that. So what is your plan when you buy that book? And buying books, I think you have to be very careful what you're buying. Know what you're buying when you're doing that due diligence, and have a plan in terms of how you're going to address that. But I think any small one advisor business will easily be able to say, I've just bought 1,000 clients. What's likely that I'm going to be reviewing them? But the FMA sometimes speaks in those terms as well, in terms of, I think historically, that very passive, non-personalized email that says, I'm going to offer you a review, has been considered a review of some sort, which is highly disappointing. So, and maybe Tracey has something to add on that space, whether or not it's an actual review or an offer of review, because I think those terms have consistently been confused in the industry over the long period of time.
Look, I agree with that. It's certainly not a review to offer a review, but just coming back to the purchase of the books, I think that, due diligence on any book being purchased is just sort of essential. I mean, it's not just or no longer is it just purchasing a revenue stream or building the client numbers. These are sort of clients that you are responsible for and for servicing. Your obligations have just sort of increased. So it's, as Steve said, how are you going to service those clients? What do you need to do? What are the gaps? How are you going to develop those relationships with them? And how do they sort of fold into your existing business are really important questions. I mean, it really is just upping the ante, and at all of these sort of stages throughout, sort of your advice career and running your business, at these touch points, we now need to think about, well, okay, what does that really mean? It's not just about sort of revenue streams.
Yeah, and if I can just touch on a point that we'll speak to a little bit after, managing the value of your book. If you're an older advisor who's working their way through to retirement and you have poor record keeping, or maybe you don't even realize, 5 years before you sell your book, you should have an assessment done in your book. Say, what is the likelihood I'm going to get maximum value? Because if I'm buying a book, and as Tracey said, I need to have a plan. I need to understand exactly when these people have been seen. It's no longer you just buy this revenue stream and it just kind of sits over there and ticks over, and you just kind of, just sit there like Scrooge McDuck taking in the money. You've got to be active. And I personally, I don't like to see these passive attempts of reviews and people say, oh, I've tried to review them. I sent them an email that only 1% of our base responds to, kind of thing.
You tried telling that to the FMA. I mean,
yeah. So I think it's quite important that you consider what you're buying and you do a lot of due diligence on it. But for advisors that know they're going to be selling their book in the next couple of years, you can do a lot to improve the value of that book. But realistically, what you should be doing is just applying best practice standards now as you become a FAP. So, and some of these things we'll talk about in this slide. How do you manage gone, no address, or return to sender responses, email kickbacks, missed payments and lapses? We've seen some really sticky cases with missed payments and lapses. And it's often just a simple, case of, somebody's card, expired and they got a new card, or someone moved, or, something happened in their account, and, we all know that kind of addresses tend to be poor and clients don't always answer emails. So it's really something that you need to consider, because there have been in that missed payments and lapses. a little bit of friction, I would say, from time to time we've seen. Do you track your claims? How do you know that you're actually keeping on top of communication with your clients, or that you're managing that? A claim can be the most stressful event in a client's or family's life. And it's easy for them to kind of get a little bit lost in that case when they've got, a significant number of other things going on, including doctor's appointments, potentially managing, I guess your legacy, potentially meeting with family and working on end of life stuff. It's easy for that stuff to get dropped. So that's a real value add. You should be making sure that you're communicating and being ever present in that stage. Applied terms, we see that all the time, that, loading anniversaries, you can look at it in a year or two, have it reevaluated, doesn't get done, just kind of sits in Netherland. We look at the file and say, oh, this was supposed to be done. Nobody's looked at it. So really important things, and that's going to come off quite poorly for you. And when you think about your client experience, that's when you're kind of thinking about the other end. That could actually be material. That could mean, potentially they're going to save some money there, throw it in KiwiSaver, and over 15 years, that's a really big difference in their life. So really important and this is where that data strategy comes in, which we haven't got a separate slide on that, but your data strategy is probably one of the more important pieces you can have in your business right now, and is something you should definitely be considering. And does your review process consider that clients might be vulnerable? Does it include questions requiring responses to understanding that the advice is given? Very important considerations. And like I said previously, sometimes you might consider these, that's a little bit over the top. I don't think it's over the top to the client. It's very relevant to the client. A lot of these are very relevant to the client. And we see complaints and, like I said, friction points between advisors and clients, even missed payments and lapses. We've seen a number of cases where, the client says, well, nobody contacted me. And they say, oh, we sent an email. And you're like, oh, you sent a lot of emails. So those are things to consider. Do we want to pop over to the next slide now?
Okay, that's me. Look, I'm just conscious of time, so I'll just briefly sort of touch on client vulnerability. I mean, this is just, you'll be aware that this is, sort of a top consideration for our regulator at the moment, just vulnerable clients, and particularly through the COVID sort of period. I think for advisors, and I'm sure you've all got sort of a policy around what a vulnerable customer is, it's really important that you identify vulnerable customers within your client base. And that's not necessarily easy. Clients change, no one's the same, and someone can be happy one day and then they're sort of vulnerable due to circumstances or health or stress, income changes the next day. It's something that you need to keep very much on top of, understanding what vulnerabilities are, the type of particular vulnerabilities that you might have in a client base, particularly if you dealt with one specific ethnic group, for example, and then sort of considering what sort of actions that you might take around those clients. And it might just be getting extra support to help them understand the advice, an interpreter, more time to actually ensure that they understand the advice that you've given. But I guess the message here is that, this is a very, very important area. I mean, it always is, but it's been heightened through the COVID, and it's something that, as you'll be aware, the regulator is very much across. So, So I'll say about that slide, Steve.
And I think when you're considering vulnerabilities, I really dislike the wording in the code that not taking advantage of clients' vulnerabilities. That's terrible wording, because it's not that you shouldn't be taking advantage of them. It's that you should be providing added care to them through that period. So there's kind of like that other side of the scale. And like Tracey was saying, there's a lot of information out there on this right now, and it can be very, very important to people as they move forward in life in terms of, how you deal with them through these stages and understanding them. I'll go back to data strategy once again. So it's important that you can actually note that a client's vulnerable. So how do you know who your vulnerable clients are? And then B, it's also pretty important because we won't get into the real technical pieces of what makes a client vulnerable, but some people can be vulnerable for only 2 or 3 years. You know, some people could go through divorce, maybe have depression, potentially have an injury or sickness. And then other people can be on the other side of that. And this is going to be a lifelong ailment for them. So it's good to be able to really specifically note for your record keeping kind of where they're at. And in terms of the review cycle, that helps out a lot as well.
As you said before, Steve, in life insurance, when you're doing claims, it's usually a period of vulnerability for most clients.
Yeah, yeah. Fantastic. Do we want to pop over to the next slide? So customer demographics, life stage changes. This is one of the things that, you know, we've talked about in terms of that review cycle, how quickly people's lives change. And, you know, I do look back at my life and I've thought about this because some advisors have said, oh, 3 years is a bit much and oh, we don't need a minimum. And I can really honestly say my life has changed, and maybe I've moved countries and that kind of thing, but my life has changed very substantially, at least every 3 years. So it's really important that you think about it, not necessarily from your business process, but from the client's perspective. Is their life likely to have changed at least every 3 years? And I would say yes. You know, certainly offering a review, keeping on top of life stage changes. Like I said, you know, if you know somebody's, you know, changed jobs, if you know they've moved. And for some advisors that are in kind of smaller areas and smaller towns, you know, you're driving past these people all the time. You hear from, you know, any one of a number of people about, you know, different clients and that kind of thing. So it's relatively easy to keep on top of. So if you know somebody's had a kid, you know, maybe you should give them a call and say, oh, do we need to look at that? If you know they've moved because you see a for sale sign on their lawn, you know, you need to have a conversation with them. There's a lot of life stage indicators that indicate you should actually initiate a conversation for a review. But overall, if you don't know any of those, we would say definitely look at that. And some things to really, you know, keep in the front of your mind. You know, it's great that you limit a scope and you say, oh, I only deal with insurance. Somebody can have maximum levels of insurance, be optimally, you know, insured, but at some point that doesn't really provide them with a good retirement. So you should be considering, and, you know, maybe just ask the question to refer them to someone else. You know, make sure that their retirement is sorted out, make sure that they have a plan, because getting to 60 and not having a plan doesn't mean they got good financial advice. It means maybe you gave them good financial advice in a limited scope, and which is fine, but understand, you know, the ultimate goal in life is potentially not just that area to get through to retirement. Do you know what their KiwiSaver status is? That's an easy question to ask. Such an important variable as people move through to retirement. And we all know the earlier you start, the more regular the contributions, the better off people are in KiwiSaver. You know, as people age, you're looking at different products. So, you know, in theory, most life insurance calculators kind of then every year after, unless people have had kids or more expensive houses, you know, you should be looking at, you know, where is the client most likely to claim? What areas? Do you want to shift some of that budget into that health space, trauma, KiwiSaver, that kind of thing, where the client's actually going to claim on those and that's going to add value? Because realistically, we all know what the calculators look like. And if a lot of your budget's going there and it's not being shifted to these other areas, I don't necessarily think that provides a very good outcome for the client, you know, as they approach retirement. And one of the things is most with our health system these days, most people approach retirement, even in pandemic days. Do you have a will and is it current? Very important thing to consider. You may not do wills, you likely don't, but it's great to at least give them advice that they're very important and that they should really consider that. And do they need a financial plan versus product advice? As people age, you need to think about, like I said, you can be optimally insured, but you haven't prepared for retirement, and that isn't necessarily a good outcome for a client. So at some point, you need to consider, is just giving one area of advice substantial enough to get them through to retirement and a good outcome in retirement? Do you have any thoughts there, Tracey?
Oh, look, I agree with all of that. I think that it really is important to consider those life changes. And I think, there was a question there about, advisors that sort of look at changes regularly with regard to risk and KiwiSaver, but then with regard to medical products, are there really, many changes? And I think that's a question. I think if you're engaging with your client, you will know whatever changes, may be applicable. Maybe there's none, but it is just that engagement with the client.
Yeah. And usually it's not going to hurt if you're having that conversation with them.
Well, it deepens the relationship, isn't it? And I think this is all good conduct, which underlines everything.
Yeah. And then popping over to the next slide.
Okay, everyone loves to talk about enforcement. I won't labour on all the penalties. I'm sure you're aware of where you fall. But what I wanted to do was just really sort of touch on two things. So I referred to the FMA annual corporate plan being released, focus on the customer. That's very important. We've got a new regime in place. FMA is going to be monitoring and is going to be looking to take enforcement action. So, we all need to be very vigilant at all times to make sure that we're complying, but certainly when we've got a new regime, we need to make sure that we are doing everything that we can to comply. The other thing I was going to touch on was just the recent case, the Financial Advisors Disciplinary Committee case that came out in March. You would have seen the headings, code breaches, forces retirement. What I just wanted to refer to there is that, those breaches were around record keeping, together with really not understanding obligations. And I think, we've talked about these sort of points. These, are just so important foundational aspects of the regime. We need to have good record keeping. We need to understand our obligations. And these breaches were, they were described as less serious, yet the advisor was sort of taken to task and in the end left the industry. The breaches, any breach will not be treated lightly. And we really, if that's one message to take away, please do. We need to ensure that we're embracing everything that Steve and I have sort of talked about today. We need to make sure that we very much understand all of the obligations under the regime, including even the obligations under the agency agreements, as Steve said. And if we don't understand them, get help, ask questions. There are lots of people to support you, through the industry. And those coming back to the record keeping, it's keeping good quality records. It's the whole regime, the regulators' approach is about show me, don't tell me. So really having professional records to produce if need be. So I can't, highlight, we're in this sort of, this period whereby our regulator will be looking to monitor and enforce. As I said, you don't want to be the sort of a scalp on their, I don't know what they put you on, but whatever. You don't want to be the next sort of headline. You've got lots of support and assistance. EPC's been doing a fabulous job with these, with the webinar series. So reach out if you do need some assistance.
Yeah, and if I just wanted to make 2 points. One, carrying on from what you were saying, in terms of in any time you're dealing with the FMA, in terms of a potential penalty or an investigation, it's very stressful, and I can't state enough the personal impact that has had on advisors that we've dealt with. It's very common to see advisors who wanted to stay in the industry longer, something went wrong, and then all of a sudden they find themselves out of the industry. That means the retirement plans are being impacted, could potentially mean the value of their book has been significantly impacted. So really something, there aren't many of these cases that go forward, but the impact on the individual advisor is significant. And I can very honestly say, no matter what age, advisors that go through that process are permanently changed by that. Very tough. On the enforcement piece, the FMA right now seems to be looking at marketing quite a bit. That seems to be, they've been relatively, I guess, open in the sense that they don't have an oversight plan in terms of these are the businesses we're going to go see. But, if you are an active marketer, make sure you're meeting the standards, the required standards. They are actively looking at it, and it's very easy for them now. They can just go on LinkedIn and Facebook and find you quite simply. So something for you to definitely consider if you actively market. Make sure you understand your obligations and what you can and cannot say.
The other point being too that the FMA is continuing to increase their own resources, for the monitoring of the new regime. So there will be more attention given to everyone in the industry.
And there are also resources now dedicated to this area, where in the past they had one supervision team that looked at the entire market. Now they've got a supervision team that, that's focused just on financial advice providers and financial advisors. Okay, shall we go to the next slide to wrap up? It's up to me, I think, to say thank you to you both. I found that that content was really, really valuable. And to me, the big standout is around the need to understand the customer's journey. So to be in the customer's shoes and think about how they remember you and how they remember what you have told them, and how you might need to bring that back to them when you do a review. And secondly, the importance of those reviews, how the customer's life changes on a regular basis. And if you even think back to our own lives or our children's lives or our friends' lives of what's happened to them in the last 3 years, we get children being born, children growing, changing schools, marriages break up, people change jobs on a fairly regular basis, or even if they don't change jobs, their income, their salary can increase. So there's a lot that happens to us, and those things do result in changes required to the cover that they have or the investments that they hold. And so it's really, really important that the client does get those reviews. And as you've pointed out, Steve, quite strongly, an email that goes out once a year just isn't enough. We all know from our own inboxes that they get filled very quickly, and we miss things. Or we put things off because they're not important to us. So, following up with a text message, with a phone call, and just really probing and making sure that those clients do get those reviews on a periodic basis. So I think with that, it just comes to me to say thank you both very, very much for your time and for your expertise and sharing it with us today. So this is usually the case where at the time we would ask everyone for a big round of applause. So it'll have to be a virtual round of applause. It's a little bit silent because of the webinar format. But again, thank you both very, very much. And I'll look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thanks everyone for coming. Remember, you can find the recordings for past webinars at advice.fsc.org.nz and reach out to our experts at any time if you have any further questions, because they are available to be engaged on a professional basis. So please do so. Thanks everybody.